Welcome back to another Q&A, guys. The first question this week: when to do a primer phase and how to structure it. So, Revive Stronger does have a book all on primer phases that is really helpful. I've gone through it multiple times. I helped in creating it, so definitely recommend that. But I'm not going to leave you hanging here. So, I like to use a primer phase in one case in particular to where it's kind of my go-to. And other than that, I tend to not use primer phases a whole lot. But there are a couple cases to where I do like to use them. All right. So in one case I like to use them is following a fat loss phase. And for those that aren't familiar with primer phases, it's essentially a phase in which you do maintenance training, maintenance diet for mesocycle, so 4 to 6 weeks, somewhere in there. And the kind of purposes around a primer phase might help kind of resensitize you to training volume again. And the idea behind that is if you're doing higher and higher training volumes for a long time, you might get to a point to where you're doing quite a bit of volume, but you're still not noticing like the same sort of pumps that you used to get, and your performance isn't as good and stuff like that. So it might resensitize you a little bit to that. And coming back to when I really like to use them, it's following a fat loss phase. And when I say fat loss phase, I'm talking about like an extended fat loss phase, like a standard cut of maybe 6 to anything much over 6 weeks, and then up to maybe 12 to 14 weeks, 15 weeks, 16 weeks. I like to follow that up with a primer phase that's in some sort of corresponding somewhat to the length of the diet and how a client is feeling and stuff like that. So if a client just finished a 16-week diet and they're feeling very beat up, then I might run a 6 or 7 week kind of maintenance phase or primer phase. And I think that this really just sets someone up so much better for a gaining phase rather than jumping right back into it, because they can drop a ton of diet fatigue. They can drop a lot of that food focus. They can get themselves back to a place to where they're feeling better in the gym. Their hormones are probably a lot better after this primer phase, and they're just generally feeling like they're able to push it again. And I feel like that's just such a nice transition into a gaining phase. So I really like primer phases after an extended cutting phase, 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how you're feeling after a cutting phase, maintenance training. So I would say anywhere from 5 to 8 challenging sets per muscle per week, somewhere in there. Reps in reserve, I would still go from about 3 to 4 reps in reserve down to 0 to 1 reps in reserve across the mesocycle. Maybe work in more of a kind of strength rep range. So maybe keeping things in the 5 to 12 rep range for the most part, rather than getting into more metabolic style training and stuff like that. Training a muscle a couple times a week, still a good idea, although you could maintain on less than that. Maybe reducing your overall training frequency a little bit. Not a bad idea, as having more extra rest days during this time can help with recovery and stuff like that. So that is kind of the overall structure that I like to see, and when I particularly like to use it in that scenario. So following extended fat loss phase for 4 to 6 weeks of somewhere with that volume, that intensity and stuff like that. And I generally don't scale volume much throughout a maintenance period. Now, there's also another case to where I like to use them. And that case is if I have a client, and I tend to really push for long, extended gaining phases with clients. And if we're like on week 7 or 8 of straight hypertrophy training after hypertrophy training, sometimes they do let me know like, hey, I don't feel like I'm getting very good pumps anymore, or I'm feeling a little fatigued when I start up my mesocycle again, or training just doesn't feel like it kind of was at the start. And there's just signs of we've got quite a bit of accumulated fatigue that's built up. In those scenarios, okay, I would look to either a primer phase over an active rest. And honestly, so an active rest, that's basically like a double deload, back-to-back deload phases. And technically, that might not be precisely what is like defined in the literature as an active rest phase, but I'm looking at it from a bodybuilding perspective of mainly kind of like a double deload or a deload and then a week off. And I lean towards using an active rest phase over a primer phase because I think that you get very similar benefits in like half of the time. So I kind of default to a double deload or an active rest phase. Now, when might I go with a primer instead of an active rest? Well, like I said, when someone has been dieting and they need to clear that diet fatigue and stuff like that, and they need more time to do that, primer phase, absolutely. Also, maybe if we've tried active rest phases in the past and it worked okay, but after like another 1 or 2 mesocycles, we were still feeling ourselves in the same spot, then I might look to kind of pull that full primer phase lever next. Primer phase also might be useful as a gap between like contests. So if you have a diet before a diet and then you want to do a kind of maintenance period and then go to your final push, then we might be looking at a primer phase there. But for the most part, I like primer phases after an extended cut. You could do them to kind of split up multiple hypertrophy mesocycles if you're starting to feel that accumulated fatigue a little bit, but I kind of default to active rest phases. And then I also talked about kind of the structure there. So I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions around that. I'd be happy to help you out, all right? And we do have that ebook as well that goes into detail as well, but let me know if you have any questions. Next question. Should you keep the calories the same every day while massing, or should you have some fluctuations? And my general response is that, and this is usually kind of asked around, okay, should I have like training and maintenance or training day and rest day calories? And I'm more so in the camp that it's fine if you want to fluctuate your calories a little bit. Like, I think that in the evidence-based crowd, it's kind of frowned upon to do any sort of calorie cycling or anything like that. And I think it's fine. I think that if someone, especially if someone's like, hey, I'm not very active at my job. I get like, I don't know, under 5,000 steps a day on days I don't train. On days I train, I'm definitely more hungry and I have more of an appetite, and I can definitely tell that my energy expenditure is up a little bit. In those scenarios, I might have a few 100-calorie difference between training and off days. Now, do I think that you should be in a 200-calorie surplus on training days and then try to be in a calorie deficit on off days and stuff like that? No, I think that's a good way to just kind of spin your wheels and not really get anywhere. But if your activity levels are objectively different on training and off days, and your hunger levels correspond with, hey, I just don't have as much of an appetite on these days, and you want to adjust your calories by a few hundred on your off days, I think that sounds plenty reasonable. And I don't really see a reason why you wouldn't try an approach like that. And now there's other parts to this of psychology of, we don't necessarily want to have the mentality of I can't eat on days to where I don't train, but I think that if you have just a couple 100-calorie difference, it's not going to be a big deal. So as long as it's reasonable and within reason, it's not a crazy difference, I think it's fine. Do I think it's going to be a big deal either way? Probably not. Ultimately, I'd shoot for that target rate of gain that you're looking for on a monthly basis. I like around 1% of body weight for most people. And yeah, that's kind of how I approach that. All right. So I think it's fine as long as it's kind of reasonable there. All right. Next question. What happens if you don't get enough protein while dieting? Right. So protein, when we eat protein, it helps stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And at the end of the day, our protein synthetic balance at the end of the day is what's going to kind of determine our muscle mass, at least for the most part. So if we're in a calorie deficit and we're not eating enough protein and we're not elevating that muscle protein synthesis, and during a calorie deficit, we might have a little bit more muscle protein breakdown, that's going to kind of shift that muscle protein balance in a direction that we don't really want it. So if you don't eat enough protein while dieting, there's a chance that you're potentially going to lose some muscle mass because you're in that kind of negative protein balance. And there's a little bit of research on whether while you're dieting, you might need actually more protein to hang on to your muscle. To me, that makes the most intuitive sense. I haven't looked at that research actually for quite a while. That would make the most intuitive sense to me, and I say that because when you're going through a gaining phase, you're eating like carbohydrates and just calories in general is going to be anti-catabolic in general. So when you're in catabolism, that is like a state of breakdown. That's the fancy term for it. It's hard to kind of find that balance of, I don't want to define every single term I say to where it's like annoying for people that are really into this stuff. And I feel like if you're watching my channel, you're definitely probably more experienced. Like that's my general perception of things, but I also don't want to exclude anybody that doesn't know these terms. So hopefully I try to find that balance there, but that's kind of catabolism, tissue breakdown. And when we're going through a gaining phase, we're just generally more anabolic in general. So to me, it would make sense that we might not need as much total protein to hang on to our muscle during the gaining phase. But through a cutting phase, if we're a little bit more catabolic, we might want to err on the side of actually more protein. So now that can also go too far, I think, to where if you're having so much protein during a cutting phase, you don't have enough carbs to support your training. That could also be not great because carbohydrates are also kind of protein sparing as well. And they help with that protein balance equation. So absolutely, if you don't get enough protein while dieting, I think that you're definitely at risk of muscle loss. I'm comfortable with most people probably hitting at least a gram per pound while they're dieting. Now, you could probably take that to a gram per pound of lean body mass, but for a lot of people, I think that that's probably a level of detail that we don't need to worry about as much. And it's usually just easier to calculate based on total body mass. And if you're a little bit higher while dieting, I also think that that's not a big deal either, So long story short, try to eat about a gram per pound of protein while dieting. And I think that you're still fine. All right. And make sure that you're training and stimulating your muscles. And the fourth question this week asked me, my shoulders are lacking. Should I implement some overhead pressing? And when it comes to like front delt work, I generally don't program it a ton because I think that your overall pressing movements, incline pressing, I program plenty of that to where it's really rare for me to hear that a client's like, hey, my front delts are really lacking and I need to bring them up. And as long as I'm not getting that sort of feedback, I don't generally program much front delt work. Now, every once in a while, I like to throw in a nice little overhead dumbbell shoulder press or something like that, just to make sure like we're giving them some attention. And if you do program some direct work, I think that you can be pretty, like just with like 3 to 6 sets per week, that plus your pressing movements, I think that that's going to be plenty for most people to get them looking right if they're not already looking right. And I do have clients that are like, hey, when I don't have straight up vertical pressing work, my delts just don't quite look right. And in those scenarios, I'm like, hell yeah, we can program some of that. But usually it doesn't take much. And like I said, it's like 3 to 6 sets and then that gets them looking right. So I absolutely think that, hey, if your shoulders seem to be lacking a little bit, maybe some overhead work would kind of help that anterior portion. And I would say that when a lot of people are looking for that kind of capped shoulder look, it's much more so the what they're lacking is kind of the side delt and maybe even the rear delt too. So I would probably still prioritize the medial delt and the rear delt. But if you're like, my front delts just don't quite look right, absolutely incorporate some of that work there as well. All right. And the final question here, what is the ratio that I like of kind of compounds to isolation lifts? And they asked me in particular with a kind of push-pull leg split. And I think that actually thinking about your training split here a little bit makes sense in the context of this question, because if you're training with a push-pull leg split, you're training like all your pushing exercises twice per week and all of your pulling twice a week. How many exercises in that push session should be those big compounds and stuff like that? And I think that in a setup like this, I don't like to see much more than like, it's going to be pretty challenging to have much more than like 2 to 3 kind of bigger compounds in a single session. So for a push session, I think that a good setup is maybe 2 compounds and 1 isolation. And then for a pull session, maybe the same thing. 2 compounds and then maybe something more isolation-y. So a vertical pull, and where do you draw the line at compounds? That's tricky as well. So like I would still, like with back movements, I still think that like a cable row or something like that, that's still pretty compoundy. And a pull down, that's still pretty compoundy. And just because it's a machine doesn't necessarily mean it's not like a multi-joint exercise and stuff like that. So I think that anywhere from 2 to 3 exercises for compounds and then 1 to 2 isolations in that sort of split makes sense. And I think that works pretty general for most splits as well. So a general structure that I like for push-pull legs is on that push day, maybe we have a horizontal press that's pretty compoundy, and then we have a vertical press that's pretty compoundy, and then maybe an isolation fly or something like that. And then on your pull day, maybe we have a horizontal row that's pretty compoundy, a vertical pull down or something like that, a pull up, and then maybe a lat pullover that's a little bit more isolation-y. And maybe you have 1 or 2 tricep exercises on your push day, 1 or 2 bicep exercises on your pull day. And on your leg day, doing much more than 2 like heavy hitting leg compounds is going to be tough. So I think that maybe you do a squat and an RDL on one day, and then on the other day, maybe it's a squat and a lunge. So in general there, I like to see about maybe 2 or 3 compounds, and then maybe 1 isolation lift for the chest, and then a couple of exercises for the triceps for that push-pull legs. And in general, I tend to keep my structure like that, regardless of the split of maybe like no more than probably 2 or 3 kind of really taxing compound lifts per workout, because then it's going to get pretty dang tough. All right. So let me know if you have any questions about that. Appreciate you guys tuning in. I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you in that next one.